People thought the lonely man came for the coffee. They were wrong. He came for a promise nobody else remembered. Every Friday at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the bell above the cafe door rang once. Never early, never late. The timing was so precise that some of the regular customers could set their watches by it. The small cafe sat on a quiet corner in downtown Boston, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. It was the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. Warm lights glowed behind the windows. Soft jazz drifted through the air. The scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon lingered long after customers left. Most people came for comfort. One man came for something else. At precisely 4 o'clock, Nathan Walker stepped inside. He was 45 years old, a white American businessman whose name appeared regularly in financial magazines and technology news headlines. Thousands of employees worked for his company. Millions of dollars moved through accounts carrying his signature. Yet none of that mattered when he walked through the cafe door. Here, he was simply a quiet man arriving for his usual table. He nodded politely to the staff and crossed the room. Every Friday, the same path, the same destination, the same table beside the front window overlooking a small city park. The chair facing the window always belonged to him. The chair across from him remained empty. It had remained empty for years. Nathan removed his coat and folded it carefully over the back of the chair. Then he sat down and looked outside. Children played beneath orange autumn leaves. Office workers hurried home. Couples walked hand in hand along the sidewalk. Life moved forward. It always did. A few moments later, a waitress approached carrying a notepad she rarely needed. Grace Mitchell was 26 years old. Quiet. Observant. The kind of person who noticed details others missed. Her light brown hair was neatly tied back. Her expression was calm and warm without ever demanding attention. She stopped beside Nathan's table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." Nathan offered a small smile. "Good afternoon, Grace." She already knew his order. Everyone did. Yet she asked anyway. It had become part of the ritual. The usual? Nathan glanced toward the empty chair. Just for a second. Then he nodded. The usual. Grace wrote nothing down. She never needed to. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a tray. 2 cups of coffee. Not one. 2. Both identical. Both fresh. Both placed carefully on the table. One in front of Nathan. One in front of the empty chair. Several customers noticed. They always noticed. Most assumed the second cup belonged to someone running late. Others assumed Nathan expected a guest who never arrived. New customers often watched the empty chair for 20 minutes before realizing nobody was coming. But Nathan never explained. He simply sat there every Friday, drinking from one cup while the other slowly grew cold. Across the cafe, whispers drifted between tables. The mystery had become part of the cafe's identity. Some thought it was superstition. Others believed it was grief. A few imagined a secret business meeting. Grace heard the theories every week. Yet unlike everyone else, she never joined the conversation. Because while the rest of the cafe watched the empty chair, Grace watched Nathan. And over time, she had begun noticing things that made her wonder whether the second cup of coffee was not waiting for someone at all. Grace Mitchell had worked at the cafe for nearly 3 years, and during that time, she had learned something important. Most people revealed themselves through repetition. The businessman who always checked his phone before sitting down. The college student who ordered extra whipped cream before every exam. The elderly woman who brought the same paperback novel every Tuesday afternoon. Habits were like fingerprints. Unique. Quiet. Easy to miss unless someone paid attention. Grace paid attention. That was why she noticed things other people overlooked. The cafe was busy that Friday afternoon. The espresso machine hissed steadily. Ceramic cups clinked against saucers. Conversations rose and fell like gentle waves. Yet even in the middle of the noise, Grace found herself glancing toward Nathan's table. Not because he was famous. In fact, many customers had no idea who he was. She watched because his routine never changed. At 4 o'clock, he arrived. At 4:05, 2 coffees appeared. At 4:10, he looked out the window. And at some point during every visit, his eyes drifted toward the empty chair across from him. Most people thought he was waiting for someone. Grace was beginning to suspect something different. As she wiped down a nearby table, another waitress approached. "Your mysterious customer is back," the woman whispered with a playful smile. Grace glanced toward Nathan. "He is not mysterious." "Really?" her co-worker laughed. The man orders 2 coffees every week and drinks only 1. That sounds mysterious to me. Grace smiled politely, but said nothing. The truth was she had stopped wondering why he ordered 2 cups. Instead, she had started wondering why he never removed the second one. Most people would eventually push it aside. Nathan never did. The untouched cup remained exactly where Grace placed it, as though its presence mattered, as though moving it would somehow break an invisible rule. 40 minutes passed. The afternoon sunlight softened outside the window. Long shadows stretched across the sidewalk. Nathan sat quietly reading a book he rarely seemed to turn pages in. Every few minutes he glanced toward the city park across the street. Then he checked the antique clock hanging above the cafe counter. Grace noticed that too. Every Friday. The same clock. The same glance. The same thoughtful expression. At exactly 4:17, something curious happened. Nathan closed his book. He looked at the clock. Then he looked toward the empty chair. Not for a second. Not for 2. For nearly half a minute. His expression changed slightly. Not sadness. Not happiness. Something deeper. Something quieter. Then he lowered his eyes and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The moment passed. Anyone else would have missed it. Grace did not. Her attention lingered on the old clock. 4:17. She replayed the scene in her mind. Last Friday. The Friday before that. The same thing had happened every time. Nathan always looked at the clock at exactly 4:17. Then at the empty chair. Then nowhere else for several seconds. A pattern. And patterns usually meant something. Across the room, customers continued talking and laughing without noticing. Outside, leaves drifted across the sidewalk beneath a cool autumn breeze. Inside, Grace quietly carried another tray toward the kitchen. Yet one question followed her every step. Why did 4:17 matter so much to a man who seemed to have everything? And why did it always begin with that second untouched cup of coffee? The following Friday arrived beneath a gray October sky. Clouds drifted low over Boston, turning the afternoon lights soft and silver. Inside the cafe, the familiar rhythm continued. Coffee grinders hummed. Customers settled into worn leather chairs. Steam curled upward from fresh cups resting on polished wooden tables. Yet for Grace, the day felt different. Once she noticed the pattern, she could not stop thinking about it. 4:17. Every Friday. The same glance toward the clock. The same look toward the empty chair. The same silence that followed. By 3:45, she was already preparing the table by the window. She straightened the sugar packets. Adjusted the salt shaker even though nobody used it. Smoothed a wrinkle from the tablecloth. Small tasks. Quiet tasks. The kind that helped pass time while questions waited for answers. At exactly 4 o'clock, the bell above the door rang. Nathan stepped inside. The routine unfolded exactly as expected. The same dark coat. The same calm expression. The same polite greeting. Grace delivered the 2 coffees without needing to ask. Nathan thanked her with a slight nod. Then he settled into his seat and opened a hardcover book. Outside the window, autumn leaves drifted through the park. A father pushed a stroller along the sidewalk. 2 elderly women shared a bench near a fountain. Life continued in ordinary ways. Nathan rarely seemed part of it. He looked present and distant at the same time. As the minutes passed, Grace noticed something else. Nathan never truly read his book. He turned pages occasionally, but his eyes spent more time focused beyond the glass. Sometimes on the park, sometimes on the empty chair, sometimes nowhere at all. It reminded her of people waiting for a train they knew was never coming. At 4:15, Grace found herself glancing at the clock. Then at Nathan. 2 minutes later, it happened again. Nathan closed his book. His hands rested quietly on the table. He looked toward the antique clock above the counter. 4:17. Then his eyes moved to the empty chair. The cafe noise seemed to fade around him. Customers laughed. Cups clinked. A blender roared briefly behind the counter. Yet Nathan appeared completely removed from it all. His expression softened. Not with sadness exactly. With memory. As though he were seeing something invisible to everyone else. 20 seconds passed. 30. Then he lowered his gaze and touched the handle of the untouched coffee cup. Not lifting it. Not moving it. Simply resting his fingers there for a moment. Grace felt a chill she could not explain. This was not habit. This was ceremony. Across the room, a new customer leaned toward another server and whispered, "Does he always order 2?" The server shrugged. "Every week." The customer laughed lightly. "Strange." Grace looked back toward Nathan. Strange was not the right word. People called things strange when they did not understand them. There was meaning here. She could feel it. Later, as Nathan prepared to leave, he placed a generous tip beneath his saucer. Then he paused. For the briefest moment, his hand rested on the back of the empty chair, almost like a goodbye. Then he walked out into the cool afternoon air. Grace stood motionless beside the table. The second cup remained untouched. The coffee inside had grown cold, just like every Friday before. But now she was certain of one thing. Nathan was not coming here to remember a place. He was coming here to remember a person. The following week arrived with a steady autumn rain. Gray clouds hung low above the city, and the windows of the cafe shimmered beneath tiny streams of water. Inside, warm yellow light reflected across polished tables and steaming cups. The contrast made the cafe feel like a refuge from the world outside. Grace arrived early for her shift. She hung her coat near the employee entrance, tied her apron, and immediately found herself looking toward the table by the window. Nathan's table. She smiled slightly at the thought. Strange how a person could become part of a place without speaking very much. By noon, customers filled the room. By 2 o'clock, the rain intensified. By 3:30, Grace had already prepared the familiar table. Fresh napkins. 2 clean cups waiting nearby. The same arrangement as always. She told herself she was simply doing her job. Yet a small part of her knew that was not entirely true. Curiosity had quietly settled into her routine. At exactly 4 o'clock, the bell above the door rang. Grace looked up automatically. Nathan stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. Something seemed different. Not dramatic. Subtle. The kind of difference only someone observant would notice. His smile appeared slower. His shoulders seemed heavier. The exhaustion in his eyes lingered a little longer than usual. He greeted Grace politely and walked toward the window table. Minutes later, 2 coffees rested where they always did. Nathan thanked her and opened his book. Outside, the park looked nearly empty. Rain had driven most people indoors. A lone jogger crossed the pathway. A woman hurried beneath a bright red umbrella. Beyond them, trees swayed in the wind. The world felt muted. Around 4:15, Grace noticed Nathan checking his watch more often than usual. Then he looked toward the antique clock above the counter. 4:16. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. 4:17 arrived. Nathan lifted his eyes toward the empty chair. The familiar ritual began. Yet this time something changed. Instead of looking away after a few seconds, he continued staring. 20 seconds. 30. Nearly a full minute. Grace felt her heart sink unexpectedly. Whatever memory lived inside that chair seemed especially heavy today. Then Nathan reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed something small. A folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. The edges were worn from age. He read it silently. A faint smile touched his face. Not a happy smile. A remembering smile. The kind people wear when speaking to someone who exists only in memory. Grace could not see the words written on the paper. She could barely see the paper itself. Yet the moment felt deeply personal. Sacred almost. Nathan folded it again and returned it to his pocket. Then he looked out the window as rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Hours later, when he finally stood to leave, something unexpected happened. The folded paper slipped from his coat and drifted unnoticed beneath the table. Nathan walked toward the door without realizing it. Grace spotted it immediately. She glanced toward the entrance. Nathan had already disappeared into the rain. Slowly, she bent down and picked up the paper. For a moment she hesitated. Then she turned it over in her hand. On the outside, written in faded blue ink, were 4 simple words that instantly made her breath catch. Same place. Every Friday. Grace stood alone beside the window table long after the last customer had left. Outside, rain continued falling beneath the glow of streetlights. Inside, the cafe felt unusually quiet. The folded paper rested gently in her hand. Same place. Every Friday. For simple words. Yet somehow they seemed heavier than the paper itself. She looked toward the door Nathan had used only minutes earlier. Part of her wanted to run after him. Another part knew she would see him again. He always came back. Every Friday. Carefully, she slipped the note into a small envelope and wrote his name across the front. Then she placed it inside the cafe office for safekeeping. The following week felt longer than usual. Monday arrived. Then Tuesday. Customers came and went. The rhythm of the cafe continued unchanged. Yet Grace found herself noticing the table by the window more often than before. She wondered what story lived behind those words. Same place. Every Friday. It sounded less like a habit and more like a promise. By Thursday evening, autumn had settled deeper over the city. Golden leaves covered sidewalks. A cold breeze moved through the streets. And by Friday afternoon, Grace felt a quiet anticipation she could not explain. At exactly 4 o'clock, the bell above the door rang. Nathan entered as he always did. The same dark coat. The same calm expression. Yet before he even reached the table, Grace noticed something unusual. His eyes immediately searched the room. Not the customers. Not the window. The floor. The tables. The space around his chair. He was looking for something. Grace walked toward him carrying the envelope. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." Nathan offered a distracted smile. "Good afternoon, Grace." Then his eyes settled on the envelope in her hand. For a brief second, genuine surprise crossed his face. Grace held it out. "I think this belongs to you." Nathan accepted it carefully, almost reverently. The moment his fingers touched the paper, something softened in his expression. Relief, gratitude, perhaps even fear that it had been lost forever. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I was worried I would never see this again." Grace nodded. It seemed important. Nathan looked down at the envelope. "It is." He slipped it safely into his coat pocket. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Grace brought the usual order. 2 coffees. One for him. One for the empty chair. Nathan stared at the second cup longer than usual. "You always remember," he said. Grace smiled gently. "Some things are worth remembering." Nathan looked at her carefully, as though wondering how much she knew. Not suspicion. Curiosity. Respect. The afternoon unfolded quietly. Customers chatted around them. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The clock continued its steady march toward 4:17. When the familiar moment finally arrived, Grace noticed something new. Nathan did not look at the empty chair immediately. First, he touched the pocket containing the note. Then he looked toward the chair. The gesture lasted only a second. Yet it confirmed what Grace already suspected. The paper and the chair were connected. The promise and the ritual belonged to the same story. Across the room, a customer laughed loudly at something a friend had said. Life moved forward as it always did. But Grace had the feeling she was standing closer than ever to understanding a secret that had lived quietly inside the cafe for many years. And for the first time, she suspected the answer was not hidden in the coffee, the clock, or even the empty chair. It was hidden in the person Nathan refused to forget. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and different. Nathan continued arriving every Friday at 4 o'clock. Grace continued bringing 2 coffees. Yet something subtle had changed between them. Not friendship exactly. Not yet. It was recognition. The quiet understanding that each of them knew the other was carrying something unspoken. Outside, November slowly replaced October. The trees in the park surrendered more leaves each day. The air grew colder. Customers entered the cafe rubbing their hands together and welcoming the warmth inside. Through it all, Nathan remained faithful to his ritual. One Friday, a sharp wind rattled the windows as 4 o'clock approached. Grace was arranging pastries behind the counter when she noticed Nathan standing outside before entering. He was not looking at the cafe. He was looking at the park across the street. For nearly a minute, he remained motionless. Then he stepped inside. His smile appeared when he saw Grace. Small. Genuine. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker." The familiar exchange felt comforting now. As she carried the 2 coffees to his table, Grace noticed something resting beside his book. A small silver pocket watch. Old. Carefully polished. Nathan followed her gaze. "It still works," he said quietly. Grace set the cups down. "It looks important." Nathan looked at the watch for several seconds before answering. "It is." The response ended there. Most people would have let the conversation die. Grace did. She never pushed. That was one reason Nathan found himself speaking more around her than he intended. Silence felt safe with her. The afternoon passed quietly. At 4:17, the ritual unfolded once again. The glance at the clock. The look toward the empty chair. The brief stillness. But this time, Grace noticed something else. Nathan smiled. Not a sad smile. Not even a nostalgic one. A real smile. It appeared only for a moment before fading, but it was enough to surprise her. Later, as she cleared a nearby table, she heard 2 customers discussing him. "Maybe he is waiting for someone who left." "Him," one suggested. Or maybe it is a business thing, the other replied. Grace looked toward Nathan and realized both were wrong. Whatever lived inside this ritual was not abandonment. It was devotion. There was a difference. Near closing time, Nathan prepared to leave. He reached for his coat, then paused. Grace. She looked up. It was the first time he had used her name without waiting for her to approach. Yes. Nathan glanced toward the empty chair, then toward the window where twilight had begun turning the glass into a mirror. Do you ever notice how certain places remember people? The question caught her off guard. I think so. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. Most people believe memories live in photographs. He rested a hand on the back of the empty chair. Sometimes they live in places instead. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nathan offered a quiet smile and walked toward the door. Grace watched him disappear into the cold evening air. When she looked back at the table, the second coffee remained untouched as always. Yet now the mystery felt closer than ever. Because Nathan had finally given her something she had not possessed before. Not an answer, a clue. And somehow she knew the story hidden inside that chair was beginning to reveal itself. December arrived quietly. The first snow of the season dusted the sidewalks outside the cafe, turning Boston into a landscape of silver rooftops and glowing streetlights. Inside, warmth wrapped around every customer who stepped through the door. The scent of roasted coffee beans mixed with cinnamon and vanilla. Holiday music drifted softly from hidden speakers. Yet despite the decorations and cheerful atmosphere, one corner of the cafe remained unchanged. The table by the window. 2 cups of coffee. 1 occupied chair. 1 empty chair. Grace noticed the consistency more than ever now. The world changed around Nathan. Seasons changed. Weather changed. Years passed. Yet his ritual remained untouched. On the second Friday of December, Nathan arrived carrying something different. It was not a book, not the silver pocket watch. It was a small rectangular box wrapped in faded blue paper. Time had softened its edges. The ribbon looked decades old. Grace noticed it immediately, but asked no questions. She simply delivered the 2 coffees and allowed the silence to settle naturally between them. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window. Children laughed in the nearby park as they built small snowmen beneath bare trees. Inside, Nathan rested the box beside the untouched coffee cup. At 4:17, the familiar moment arrived. Nathan looked toward the clock, then toward the empty chair. This time, however, he carefully placed the small box in front of the vacant seat. His expression carried a tenderness Grace had never seen before. Not grief, not loneliness, love. The realization settled over her slowly. Whatever story connected Nathan to this place had not been built on loss alone. It had been built on something beautiful first. Hours later, as the afternoon crowd thinned, Nathan remained seated near the window. The box stayed exactly where he had placed it. Finally, Grace approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "May I refill your cup?" she asked. Nathan smiled. "Please." She poured quietly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Nathan glanced at the wrapped box. "Do you celebrate birthdays here?" The question surprised her. "Sometimes. Customers bring cakes. Families gather. Things like that." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "Birthdays matter." Grace followed his gaze toward the box. "Is today someone's birthday?" Nathan looked at the empty chair. The silence that followed felt gentle rather than sad. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." Grace felt her heart tighten. She understood immediately. Not the whole story. Not yet, but enough. Nathan was not remembering an absence. He was honoring a presence. Someone who still occupied space in his life even after years had passed. When closing time finally approached, Nathan carefully picked up the box and slipped it back into his coat. Then he stood. Before leaving, he paused beside the table and looked toward Grace. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Nathan smiled. A real smile. Warm and sincere. For never treating the empty chair like a mistake. Grace watched him walk into the snowy evening. Then she turned toward the table. By the window, the second cup remained untouched. Steam no longer rose from its surface. Yet for the first time, the chair did not seem empty at all. It seemed occupied by a memory so powerful that even time had failed to erase it. The week before Christmas brought a deeper cold to the city. Snow lined the sidewalks in uneven piles, and holiday lights glowed from shop windows along every street. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere felt warmer than ever. Families gathered around large tables. Friends exchanged gifts wrapped in bright paper. Laughter drifted through the room alongside the scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries. Yet amid all the celebration, Grace found herself watching the table by the window. Nathan had become part of the cafe's rhythm, as familiar as the clock above the counter or the bell above the door. At exactly 4 o'clock that Friday, the bell rang once. Nathan stepped inside carrying a small layer of snow on his coat. Grace greeted him with a smile and immediately noticed something unusual. He was holding a thin leather notebook she had never seen before. As always, he walked toward the window table. As always, 2 coffees arrived minutes later. And as always, the second cup remained untouched. The afternoon unfolded quietly. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the fading daylight. Inside, customers shared stories and holiday plans. Nathan opened the leather notebook and slowly turned its pages. He did not read continuously. Instead, he paused often, studying certain pages before moving on. Grace could not see what was written inside, but she noticed the expression on his face. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes his eyes seemed distant. It looked less like reading and more like remembering. At 4:17, the familiar ritual returned. Nathan glanced at the clock, then toward the empty chair. His hand rested on the notebook. For several seconds, he remained perfectly still. Grace watched from behind the counter. The moment felt different today. Not heavier, more intimate, as though whatever memory lived inside this place had drawn closer. An hour later, business slowed. Grace carried a fresh pot of coffee toward Nathan's table. As she poured, the notebook shifted slightly. A small photograph slipped halfway from between its pages. Nathan quickly steadied it, but not before Grace caught a glimpse. A young woman, bright eyes, a warm smile, standing beside a much younger Nathan. Snow seemed to fall around them in the picture. The image vanished back into the notebook almost immediately. Neither mentioned it. Yet the photograph answered something Grace had wondered for months. The person connected to the empty chair was real. Not simply an idea, not a symbol. A real woman whose presence still lingered in Nathan's life. As evening approached, Nathan closed the notebook and looked toward the window. The park across the street sparkled beneath holiday lights wrapped around the trees. "The city looks different this time of year," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "Everything feels brighter." Nathan smiled faintly. "Some memories do that." The words lingered between them. After he left that evening, Grace stood beside the table collecting the cups. One empty, one untouched. The same as always. Yet now the mystery no longer felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. It felt like a story waiting to be told. And for the first time, Grace believed the answer was closer than either of them realized. The first Friday after Christmas arrived beneath a clear winter sky. The holiday crowds had faded. Decorations still hung inside the cafe, but the excitement of the season had begun to settle into something quieter. Grace stood behind the counter arranging coffee cups when she noticed the table by the window catching the pale afternoon sunlight. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet somehow she felt that a turning point was approaching. At 4 o'clock, the bell above the door rang. Nathan entered carrying no notebook, no gift box, and no pocket watch. His hands were empty. Even so, something about him seemed lighter. Not happier exactly, more at peace. Grace greeted him with her usual smile and prepared the familiar order. 2 coffees. 1 chair occupied. 1 chair waiting. Nathan settled into his seat and gazed out at the park. Snow still covered the ground in scattered patches. Children chased each other near the fountain while parents watched from nearby benches. The scene felt peaceful, ordinary, human. Around 4:15, Grace delivered a fresh pitcher of water to a neighboring table. As she passed Nathan, she noticed something unusual beneath the edge of the tabletop. A faint line scratched into the wood. Curious, she glanced again. It was not damage. It was writing. Old writing. Nearly invisible after years of wear. Her heart skipped slightly. Later, when Nathan stepped away briefly to take a phone call outside, Grace found herself standing near the window table. The cafe was quiet. No customers occupied the surrounding seats. Carefully, she leaned closer. The letters had faded, but they were still there. Someone had carved them into the underside of the table many years ago. Same place. Every Friday. Grace froze. The exact words written on the note she had returned weeks earlier. Her pulse quickened. The promise had begun here. At this table. She stepped back just as Nathan returned. Neither mentioned what she had discovered. Yet throughout the afternoon, the words echoed in her mind. At 4:17, Nathan performed the familiar ritual. He looked toward the clock, then toward the empty chair. But this time Grace understood something she had not understood before. The promise was older than the note, older than the notebook, older than every ritual she had witnessed. It belonged to this place itself. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, Nathan remained seated by the window. The winter sunlight disappeared. Streetlights flickered on outside. Finally, as Grace refilled his coffee, she found herself asking a question she had carried for months. Her voice remained gentle. "Mr. Walker, may I ask you something?" Nathan looked up. "Of course." Grace hesitated for only a second. "How long have you been coming here?" Nathan's eyes drifted toward the empty chair. A quiet smile touched his face. Not sad, not painful, tender. 22 years, he said softly. Grace nearly dropped the coffee pot. 22 years. The number felt impossible. Nathan looked toward the window where snow reflected the glow of passing headlights. "Some promises deserve a lifetime," he added. Then he lifted his cup and fell silent once more. But for the first time, Grace knew she was standing only a few steps away from the truth. The next Friday arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. A light snow drifted through the city, settling softly on rooftops and park benches. Inside the cafe, warmth and quiet conversation filled the room. Grace spent most of the afternoon thinking about the words carved beneath the table. 22 years. Same place. Every Friday. The promise felt larger now. Real. Almost alive. At exactly 4 o'clock, the bell above the door rang. Nathan entered wearing his familiar dark coat. He greeted Grace with a gentle smile and took his seat beside the window. 2 coffees arrived minutes later. One for him. One for the empty chair. Some rituals had become as dependable as sunrise. Yet today felt different. Grace could sense it. Perhaps it was the snow. Perhaps it was the way Nathan seemed unusually reflective. Or perhaps it was because she had finally decided to ask the question she had carried for months. The afternoon unfolded quietly. Customers came and went. The clock continued its steady movement toward 4:17. When the familiar moment arrived, Nathan looked at the antique clock, then at the empty chair, then toward the snowy park beyond the glass. His expression held the same tenderness Grace had seen before. But now she understood that tenderness belonged to a person, not a memory alone. A person who still occupied space in his heart. Nearly an hour later, the cafe had grown quieter. Grace approached the table with a fresh pot of coffee. Nathan closed the book he had been pretending to read and looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Grace gathered her courage. "Mr. Walker?" Nathan smiled. "Yes." She hesitated only briefly. "Who used to sit there?" Her eyes drifted toward the empty chair. The question settled gently between them. Nathan did not seem surprised. In fact, he looked almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask. His gaze moved to the chair, then to the untouched coffee cup. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly past the window. "Her name was Emily," he said softly. Grace listened without moving. Nathan's smile returned, small and genuine. "She loved this cafe long before I did." He looked toward the park. 22 years ago, we used to meet here every Friday after work. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade. "Always at 4 o'clock?" Grace asked quietly. Nathan nodded. "Always." His eyes settled on the clock. And one afternoon, at exactly 4:17, she walked through that door carrying a bouquet of flowers she had bought for herself. A faint laugh escaped him. She said if nobody else was going to buy her flowers, she would do it herself. Grace smiled. She could almost picture the scene. That sounds like someone confident. Nathan's eyes brightened with memory. She was. For a moment, he seemed younger. Not a CEO, not a businessman, just a man remembering the woman he loved. Then his gaze returned to the empty chair. "That was the afternoon I realized I wanted to spend my life with her." Grace felt her heart tighten. The answer she had searched for was finally beginning to emerge. Not through mystery, through love. And as snow continued falling outside the cafe window, Nathan looked at the empty chair with a warmth that time had never managed to erase. For several moments after Nathan spoke, neither of them said anything. The cafe continued around them as if nothing had changed. Customers stirred cream into coffee. A barista called out drink orders. Snow drifted quietly beyond the window. Yet for Grace, the room felt different now. The mystery that had lingered for months was finally taking shape. Emily. A real woman. A real love story. Nathan looked down at his coffee cup and smiled faintly. She used to laugh at me, he said. Grace blinked. Why? Nathan chuckled softly. Because I was always late. The image seemed impossible. The disciplined executive who arrived at exactly 4 o'clock every Friday had once been the person keeping someone else waiting. I was building my first company back then, Nathan continued. I thought every meeting was important. Every phone call was urgent. Every deadline mattered. His eyes drifted toward the empty chair. Emily disagreed. Grace smiled. What did? She said. Nathan's smile widened. She said if a person is always too busy for the people they love, eventually they will only have time left. The words settled gently between them. Grace understood immediately why he remembered them. Some truth stayed relevant no matter how many years passed. Outside, a young couple crossed the park together, their footprints trailing behind them in the snow. Nathan watched them for a moment. Emily taught me most of the things that actually mattered. His voice remained calm, but Grace could hear the affection beneath every word. She taught me how to slow down, how to listen, how to notice things. He laughed quietly. She noticed everything. Grace felt a familiar irony. It sounded very much like someone else she knew. Nathan continued. One Friday, she arrived carrying a marker. A marker? Grace asked. A blue one. His eyes brightened with memory. She leaned under this very table and wrote something. Grace immediately thought of the words carved beneath the wood. Nathan noticed her expression and nodded. Yes, those words. Same place. Every Friday. I asked her why she was doing it. His smile returned. She said people forget things. Tables remember. Grace looked toward the underside of the table. Suddenly, the faded carving felt less like a clue and more like a voice reaching across 2 decades. Nathan rested his hand lightly on the empty chair. A year later, I proposed right here. Grace's breath caught. Nathan looked toward the window, seeing a different afternoon entirely. 4:17 in the afternoon. The exact moment I first realized I loved her. Snow continued falling outside. Inside, the cafe seemed wrapped in a quiet stillness. She said yes. Grace asked softly. Nathan laughed. A genuine laugh this time. Immediately. For a moment he looked younger. Not a successful CEO. Not a lonely man carrying memories. Just a husband remembering the happiest day of his life. Then the laughter faded into a warm smile. That is why I come here. Grace finally understood the significance of the clock. The chair. The second coffee. The promise. Every detail traced back to one moment. One woman. One life-changing answer. Yet she sensed the story was not finished. Because Nathan's eyes still carried a depth of feeling that belonged not only to love remembered, but to love missed. And as the winter light slowly faded beyond the cafe windows, Grace realized the most difficult part of the story had not yet been told. The following Friday arrived beneath a pale winter sunrise. Overnight snow had covered the city in a blanket of white, softening every rooftop and quieting every street. By afternoon, the cafe glowed warmly against the cold landscape outside. Customers stepped inside carrying scarves, gloves, and stories from their week. Grace moved between tables as she always did, but her thoughts remained fixed on the conversation she had shared with Nathan. The proposal, the promise, the woman named Emily. The story now felt complete in some ways and unfinished in others. At exactly 4 o'clock, Nathan entered. The familiar rhythm unfolded once again. 2 coffees. 1 occupied chair. 1 empty chair. Yet today, Grace noticed something different immediately. Nathan carried no book, no notebook, no keepsake. His hands rested quietly on the table as though he had finally run out of objects through which to remember. At 4:17, he looked toward the clock, then toward the empty chair. The ritual remained unchanged. But this time, Grace saw tears gathering gently in his eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not the kind that demanded attention. The quiet kind that appear when a memory arrives unexpectedly and refuses to leave. Nathan noticed her concern and offered a small smile. I am all right, he said softly. Grace nodded. She believed him. Sometimes being all right and being sad existed together. The afternoon moved slowly. Snowflakes drifted outside the window. The park appeared almost untouched beneath fresh white snow. Finally, after a long silence, Nathan spoke again. Emily passed away 8 years ago. The words settled over the table with remarkable gentleness. No bitterness. No anger. Only truth. Grace sat briefly in the empty chair beside the table while the cafe remained nearly empty between lunch and evening customers. She listened. Nathan looked out toward the snowy park. For a long time, I stopped coming here. His voice remained steady. The memories hurt too much. Grace understood. Some places became difficult to revisit because they contained too much love. Nathan smiled faintly. Then one Friday, I walked past the window and remembered something she used to say. He looked toward the empty chair. She always told me that love is not measured by how long someone stays. It is measured by how deeply they change you. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. Nathan continued. That was the day I came back. His eyes drifted toward the untouched coffee cup, and I have been coming back ever since. Outside, a child threw a snowball into the air and laughed as it broke apart. Inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapped around the conversation like a blanket. Nathan rested his hand lightly against the table. Most people think I come here because I cannot let go. He smiled. The truth is I come here because I already have. Grace looked at him carefully. What do you mean? Nathan glanced toward the empty chair one last time. I am not waiting for her. His voice was gentle. Certain. I am celebrating that she was here. For a moment, neither spoke. The meaning settled quietly between them. The second cup of coffee had never been about grief. It had never been about refusing to move forward. It was gratitude. Pure and simple. Gratitude for a love that had once existed at a small table beside a cafe window. And as snow continued falling softly outside, Grace finally understood why Nathan never missed a Friday. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow disappeared from the sidewalks. The trees in the park across from the cafe began to bloom once again. Seasons continued their endless cycle, just as they had for 22 years. Yet something inside the cafe had changed. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of change that reveals itself only when someone takes the time to notice. Grace noticed. Every Friday at 4 o'clock, Nathan still arrived. He still sat by the window. He still ordered 2 coffees. The ritual remained. But the sadness that once lingered around him had softened. The empty chair no longer seemed like a symbol of loss. It felt like a place reserved for gratitude. One bright Friday afternoon, sunlight streamed through the windows and painted golden patterns across the wooden floor. Customers chatted comfortably. The antique clock continued ticking above the counter. Grace prepared the familiar order and carried it to Nathan's table. 2 coffees. 1 occupied chair. 1 waiting chair. Nathan smiled as she placed the cups down. Thank you, Grace. You are welcome. Before she could walk away, Nathan reached into his coat pocket and removed a small photograph. The same photograph she had glimpsed months earlier. This time, he handed it to her. Grace looked down. A young Nathan stood beside a smiling woman beneath a sky full of snowflakes. Both looked impossibly happy. That was taken 2 weeks after I proposed, Nathan said. Grace studied the image carefully. Emily's smile seemed bright enough to illuminate the entire photograph. She looks wonderful, Grace replied softly. Nathan nodded. She was. For a moment they both looked at the empty chair. Then Nathan surprised her. You know, Emily would have liked you. Grace blinked. Why? Nathan laughed quietly. Because she noticed things too. The compliment lingered in the air between them. The afternoon continued. At 4:17, Nathan looked toward the clock, then toward the empty chair. The familiar ritual. Yet this time, something new happened. Grace stepped away from the counter and approached the table carrying another cup. Nathan looked up curiously. Without saying a word, Grace placed a 3rd coffee on the table. 1 cup for Nathan. 1 cup beside the empty chair. 1 cup for herself. Then she sat down for just a moment. The cafe remained busy around them. Nobody seemed to notice. Nathan looked at the 3 cups and smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. What is this? He asked. Grace glanced toward the empty chair. I thought nobody should celebrate a promise alone. For several seconds Nathan could not speak. Then he nodded. Outside, sunlight sparkled across the park. Inside, the clock continued ticking. The same place. The same Friday. Yet somehow everything felt new. After a while, Grace returned to work and Nathan remained by the window. Before leaving that evening, he paused beside the table and looked once more at the empty chair. Then he smiled. Not because he had forgotten. Not because the memories hurt less. But because someone else now understood why they mattered. As he stepped outside into the warm spring air, Nathan realized the promise had never been about holding on to the past. It had always been about carrying love forward. And sometimes, the people who understand us best are not the ones who share our history. They are the quiet souls who choose to listen to it.